As the war entered its final year, all nations were now aware of tanks. Many had even begun producing their own. Britain stood as the most seasoned nation in this endeavour. Since the Somme, the British had deployed tanks on the battlefield, learning with each engagement how they ought to be used. Until late 1917, tanks were seen largely as an auxiliary tool, machines meant to help infantry cross barbed wire and silence machine guns. However small successes were achieved, they were far from delivering the decisive victory commanders longed for. The vision of tank theorists J.F.C. Fuller and Ernest Swinton as a single striking force had not yet been fully applied. In their view, tanks had to be deployed collectively, advancing in coordination with air, infantry, and artillery elements to achieve near-perfect synergy. By late 1917, Fuller's concept was finally embraced. The chosen battlefield was Cambrai, a site of both strategic and geographic importance. However, this was not the primary target itself. Between the St. Quentin Canal and the Northern Canal stretched two parallel waterways, roughly 8 kilometers in length. Seizing this line was the first priority, securing the flanks of the operation. The ultimate aim was to break open a serious breach in the Hindenburg Line. If that could be achieved, the region would be enveloped from the flanks and the Hindenburg Line itself would be ruptured. Cambrai AI, a section of the Hindenburg Line not yet devastated, offered ideal ground for a large-scale tank offensive. 3 commanders came together to plan the operation. General Hugh Ells, head of Britain's Tank Corps, and Lieutenant Colonel J.F.C. Fuller prepared a plan convincing enough to win over General Julian Byng. Tanks, infantry, and aircraft would strike simultaneously. If executed according to plan, such a massive assault would be unstoppable. Above all, secrecy was paramount. General Byng secretly gathered hundreds of tanks and 8 infantry divisions, concentrating them along a small section of the front. History was about to witness the first great mass tank attack at Cambrai. The 20th of November 1917. At around 6 in the morning, the city of Cambrai awoke to a thunderous roar. With all their weight and clamour, dozens of Mark IV tanks revved their engines and rumbled forward toward the German trenches. Unlike in earlier operations, the ground was much more favourable. For perhaps the first time, tanks advanced across clear, solid terrain. At the outset, British plans worked with extraordinary precision. The sudden assault shocked the German army. Overhead, British aircraft supported the attack, putting the Germans under even greater strain. Yet the fog that benefited the tanks proved a handicap for the pilots, who could scarcely see their targets, indeed, even one another. Despite this, the impact of the tanks on the German positions was staggering. Tank Commander Captain Brown later recalled the opening hours. The German outposts, dazed by the sudden rain of shells, were quickly overrun. Along the whole line, tanks crouched low, then reared up, clawing their way forward toward the shattered town. But as so often before, the advance slowed as the hours passed. The British, who had driven deep through gaps hundreds of meters wide in the German lines, began to tire. Once the initial shock wore off, German forces recovered with the arrival of reinforcements. The decisive factor was the flood of troops transferred from the Eastern Front, closed by revolution in Russia. Yet these reinforcements encountered something entirely new, machines they had never seen or heard of. For many, this first confrontation with the four-cornered monsters sent them fleeing from the trenches, retreating just as had happened so many times before. Still, the British assault was losing momentum. Around Havrincourt and Graincourt, the combination of infantry and armour achieved success. But elsewhere, chaos disrupted the carefully laid plan. Some commanders, fearing the heavy fire directed at the armoured vehicles, deliberately pulled their men away, shattering the intended coordination. Even so, by the end of the first day, the British had made an advance far greater than in most other battles of the Great War. Where gains were usually measured in mere yards, the armies at Cambrai had pushed forward 6 kilometers in a single day. Yet their achievement came at terrible cost. By nightfall, 179 tanks had been destroyed or disabled, abandoned on the battlefield. The tank corps had suffered grievous losses, but the British appeared to have secured their first day objectives. From the second day onward, however, everything changed. The cooperation between tanks and infantry grew steadily worse. Tanks pressing forward without infantry became easy prey for German troops. But the most dreadful challenge awaiting the British would not come from German infantry. On the third day of the battle, through the clouds over Cambrai appeared a figure destined to become a legend of the First World War, Manfred von Richthofen. Perhaps he was the last person the British wished to see over Cambrai. For by this point, the Red Baron had already brought down nearly 60 Allied aircraft. By the time of his death in April 1918, the tally would surpass 80. At Cambrai alone, he would shoot down 2 British planes in just a few days. After roughly 10 days of British attacks, another nightmare awaited them: the German counteroffensive. From the second day of the battle, the steady arrival of reinforcements had made the German army ready to strike back. At 6 in the morning on the 30th of November, for the first time in 2 years, German troops went on the offensive. The unprepared British were caught completely off guard. Launching attacks across the whole front, the Germans recaptured one position after another. After 3 days of ferocious counterattacks, General Haig realized that he had no choice but to withdraw. With heavy losses, the British abandoned their objective at Cambrai. For the 3rd year in a row, they had failed to break through German defenses. Yet Cambrai left its mark on both sides. For the British, the battle convinced many commanders that these machines were indeed game changers. More importantly, the almost perfectly coordinated advance of the first day created a powerful propaganda effect. That initial success was so celebrated that church bells were rung across Britain. Tanks, hailed as marvels of modern technology, were paraded through the streets at home. Souvenirs and products were created to capitalize on their fame. The message to the public was clear: if we are to do more, support your army. Britain expanded its tank program and refined its tactics and strategies further in 1918. But it was the Germans who drew the most important lessons from Cambrai. Until then, their high command had regarded these monsters with skepticism. Now they understood just how effective they could be. A few weeks earlier, General Ludendorff, a classic product of the Prussian school, had declared, "The best weapon against tanks is coolness, discipline, and courage." But after Cambrai, he admitted, "No one can deny that tanks have achieved some successes. It is certain they will become an effective weapon. I believe their production must begin at once." Germany's own tank program would accelerate. The first German steps toward tank development had been taken in November 1916, 2 months after the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, where they had first encountered British tanks. The Supreme Army Command assigned the 7th Transportation Department of the Prussian War Ministry to design a combat vehicle for battlefield use. The committee overseeing the tank program was headed by Joseph Vollmer, a prominent engineer of the time. Yet Vollmer himself could not quite understand why the task had not been given to the great industrial firms. The reason was simple. Companies like Krupp, Benz, Daimler, or Maybach believed the tank race had already been lost. They did not wish to risk their business standing by engaging directly in such a state project. By then, other nations had already built tanks and were even refining their models. Germany, however, faced a greater challenge: raw materials. For most of the war, the country had been under a naval blockade imposed by the Entente powers. German war doctrine prioritized aircraft and submarines, not tanks. Shortages of essential materials were severe. Even Germany's powerful industry was struggling to stay afloat under such conditions. Design work began in late 1916, but unlike in other countries, the Germans did not treat it as a centralized state project. There was still no real infrastructure for producing this new type of weapon, and the shortages in German industry forced production to be spread across several different firms. This lack of coordination caused delays. Some companies even had to order parts through occupied Belgium due to the blockade. In one sense, however, the Germans were luckier than the Entente powers. They already had models to study. The British Mark series, the French Saint-Chamond, and the Schneider CA1 served as ready-made examples. They drew particular inspiration from captured Mark tanks and from the Saint-Chamond, whose blueprints they had acquired. As with earlier tanks, the Germans adopted the male-female distinction. Male A7V carried a single 57 mm Maxim Nordenfeldt gun and 6 machine guns. The female versions were armed solely with 8 machine gun. Yet the A7V introduced several innovations that set it apart from its predecessors. One of the most important was the suspension system. With suspension, the A7V moved more smoothly than its rivals, providing greater comfort for the crew and thus more accurate fire. Another feature absent from Allied tanks was the commander's cupola, which allowed officers to observe the battlefield and direct the tank more effectively. The A7V was also designed with protection against gas attacks. In case of a gas assault, its hatches and doors could be sealed completely to prevent leakage. The sides were protected by 20 mm of steel, the front by 30 mm, and the roof by 10 mm. Unlike other designs, its armor extended down over the tracks, reducing their vulnerability. However, the steel used was not hardened, leaving the A7V vulnerable to anything stronger than machine gun fire. In terms of crew, the A7V was more like a moving fortress than a tank. Depending on the operational plan, it carried between 17 and 25 men, virtually a small squad inside a steel shell. With so many extra features, one might expect it to be slower than its rivals. In fact, it was not. The tank was powered by 2 4-cylinder engines, jointly developed by Mercedes and Daimler, producing around 100 horsepower each. On flat ground, the A7V was not only faster than other heavy tanks, but could even outrun the Renault FT-17, the nimble ant of the battlefield. On paper, the design looked formidable. In practice, even building the prototype was painful. Engineer Joseph Vollmer was forced to scour scrapyards for parts. Such was the shortage of raw materials. At last, in May 1917, the first prototype was presented to the German army and passed all tests with flying colors. But Vollmer's triumph was followed by disappointment. Instead of hundreds of tanks, the army ordered only 20, and even that order was placed with reluctance. German industry simply could not risk committing more resources under wartime conditions. In fact, it was barely capable of producing even those 20, because different factories handled different components. No two A7Vs were entirely alike. Only if it proved itself in combat would orders be increased to 100. By the end of the year, the first A7Vs rolled out of the factory. Yet they would not be Germany's only tanks. The British had lost large numbers of armoured vehicles in battle, and these tanks weren't just Mark tanks either. Whippets, along with French Saint-Chamonds and Renault FT-17s, also fell into German hands. These captured machines, dubbed Beutepanzer, were repaired, repainted in German colours, and put into service. By 1918, British steel bore the Iron Cross. The decisive moment of the war was drawing near. German Chief of the General Staff Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy Erich Ludendorff had come to realize that the outcome of the conflict would be determined by a race against time. But over Europe loomed the shadow of a far greater danger for the Central Powers. A single telegram had been enough to draw America into the war. Yet, in the face of Europe's vast armies, the United States was still far from being a real threat to the Central Powers. Despite its powerful economy, America's military was weak, only 128,000 men, poorly trained and ill-prepared. Even these soldiers required intensive drilling before they could be thrown into battle on the Western Front. When Woodrow Wilson's chosen commander of the American Expeditionary Force, John Blackjack Pershing, toured the trenches in France, he concluded that the United States would need a force of 3 million men. The government was stunned. For the first time since 1914, Germany held numerical superiority on the Western Front. But the Americans were on their way. In November 1917, Ludendorff gathered his staff to discuss the situation. His aim was to knock Britain out of the war. The French army, already shaken by mutinies, was still fragile. If Britain were eliminated, France would surely collapse as well, leaving no war for America to intervene in, no trenches in which its soldiers could be deployed. The operation would go down in history as the Kaiserschlacht, or Spring Offensive. Ludendorff chose to strike near the Somme, the site of the hellish battles of 1916, at the scene where British and French forces met. Here lay the weakest point of the Allied line. 3 great German armies, some 78 divisions, would launch a colossal assault. Germany had steadily refined its infantry tactics as the war dragged on. General Oskar von Hutier had systematized new methods that came to be known as the Hutier tactics. Instead of mass infantry waves, troops advanced in small, fast-moving groups, leaping from position to position. Their goal was to find weak points in the defense and penetrate rapidly into the depths beyond. It was, in effect, the ancestor of the famous German blitzkrieg yet to come. Ludendorff's Operation Michael began at 5 in the morning on the 21st of March 1918. The British were overwhelmed by a storm of fire, unable even to raise their heads from the trenches. Against the incredible speed of the German advance, the British army was stunned into paralysis. By evening, German forces had advanced almost 11 kilometers. One of Ludendorff's key objectives was the critical transport hub of Amiens. Yet after several days of shock, the British under General Julian Byng rallied and resisted. Still, after 2 weeks of fighting, the Germans had advanced some 65 kilometers, a remarkable achievement under the conditions of the First World War. Day by day, the Germans drew closer to Amiens, but they faced increasingly stiff resistance. Reinforced British units gradually slowed the assault. The Germans were now just 20 kilometers from the city. The two sides clashed ferociously at Villers-Bretonneux, the last stronghold before Amiens. For the British, losing Villers-Bretonneux would mean the loss of the railway junctions upon which Amiens depended. The city would be defended at any cost. Villers-Bretonneux would not be remembered for hand-to-hand infantry combat, but for something far more extraordinary. For the first time in history, tanks from opposing armies faced each other in battle, the world's first tank versus tank engagement. The Germans had managed to field their limited number of A7Vs in time for the Spring Offensive. But there were too few for any massed armoured attack. Instead, they were employed in small-scale missions, supporting infantry and clearing trenches. At Villers-Bretonneux, this was once again the case. Yet, unexpectedly, 3 A7Vs advanced too far and suddenly found themselves confronted by 3 British Mark IVs. 3 against 3, the first tank battle in history unfolded before the crew's eyes. The British Mark IVs, under the command of Lieutenant Frank Mitchell, faced off against the German A7Vs, commanded by Lieutenant Wilhelm Blitz. For all involved, it was an entirely new experience. Mitchell's section included 2 female Mark IVs armed only with machine guns and 1 male armed with a cannon. This left the British at disadvantage. Mitchell's male Mark IVs fired first, but its opening rounds glanced off the armor of an A7Vs. Before the gunner could reload for a third shot, German machine gun fire forced the crew to take cover inside their tank. Blitz's lead A7Vs returned fire, but failed to score a hit on Mitchell's vehicle. As the males slowed to aim more carefully, the two female Mark IVs were struck by the A7Vs and forced to retreat, leaving Mitchell to fight alone. At last, Mitchell's Mark IV found its mark. A shell slammed into Blitz's A7Vs, transforming its interior into chaos. Wounded and dead lay among the crew, while Mitchell's gunner fired again, and then a third time, until smoke and flames filled the German tank. The survivors panicked and abandoned the machine. Seeing their commander's A7Vs ablaze, the other German tanks withdrew. The first tank battle in history ended as a victory for Frank Mitchell. The fate of the A7Vs in the area was little better. Blitz's stricken machine, A7Vs, was blown up by the Germans themselves to prevent its capture. A7V Mephisto became stuck in a shell crater and abandoned, while A7V Elfriede toppled over on rough ground and was likewise left behind. Even Villers-Bretonneux itself, captured by the Germans at such cost, was retaken by the Allies within days. After the failure of Operation Michael, Ludendorff launched two further coordinated offensives. One struck near the Chemin-des-Dames Ridge, intended to pin down the French army. Then, once more, the Germans would turn against the British in Flanders. On the 27th of May, 41 German divisions stormed the weak French positions on the ridge. Caught completely by surprise, the Allies collapsed. General Duchesne, like Britain's General Gough before him, failed to organize a proper defense. On the first day, the Germans captured the heights, advanced 21 kilometers, and tore open a gap nearly 40 kilometers wide in the French lines. This great success persuaded Ludendorff to abandon his planned attack in Flanders and instead push toward Paris. Over the next 3 days, German forces made tremendous gains. For the first time since 1914, they reached the Marne River. Now Ludendorff's army stood only 88 kilometers from the French capital. But this would prove to be the high watermark of the German offensives. On the 15th of July, the Germans launched their final great assault of the war, the Second Battle of the Marne. 52 German divisions went forward under the cover of a massive artillery barrage. But the Allies had learned their lessons. This last offensive played directly into the hands of Ferdinand Foch. On the 18th of July, Allied forces, spearheaded by fresh American troops and supported by 350 tanks, struck the German flanks. On the first day, they advanced 8 kilometers, threatening to encircle the German spearhead. Recognizing the danger, Ludendorff ordered a retreat. By the 4th of August, the Marne salient had vanished, along with Germany's final hopes of victory. Logistical problems, Allied reinforcements, and stiffening defenses brought the Germans to their final limit at the Marne. The Spring Offensive, launched by Germany to decide the war, had achieved some successes but failed to reach its objectives. Ludendorff, unable to secure the decisive breakthrough, began to see the end of the road. But by then it was too late. For Germany, the game was over. American forces under John Pershing had begun landing in Europe. The great gamble undertaken by Germany was now clearly lost. Compared to the beginning of 1918, when Germany briefly held numerical superiority on the Western Front, the situation had turned disastrous. The Germans had suffered around 700,000 casualties. Replacing these losses was becoming nearly impossible, while the Allies grew stronger with each passing day. From America alone, 500,000 fresh soldiers had already reinforced the Allied lines, and more were on the way. Worse still for Germany, the men being lost were the most skilled and irreplaceable, the trained Sturmtruppen. Their absence could not be made good. The Second Battle of the Marne was not merely another defeat for Germany, it was the beginning of the end. Foch's counteroffensive would become the 100 Days Offensive, the final push that ended the war. Across 4 major operations, the German armies clashed with the British and French on multiple fronts, wearing themselves out. By mid-1918, Allied tank production had reached its peak. In every battle, German forces were struck harder and harder. At the Battle of Soissons, for example, the French deployed nearly 500 tanks, 100 Saint-Chamans, 123 Schneider CA-1S, and 255 Renault FT-17s. The Germans could oppose them with just 5 tanks. The imbalance was glaring. The Germans, having already failed in the Materielschlacht, now paid the price by losing the Kaiserschlacht as well. The Second Battle of the Marne was not only a lost battle, it was the beginning of the end. The counteroffensive, led by Foch, and the Allied armies entered history as the 100 Days Offensive that brought the First World War to a close. Reinforced by American troops, the British and French launched massive assaults beginning with the Battle of Amiens in early August. Amiens would also stand out as a special battle for tanks. Supply tanks for logistics, transport tanks for carrying infantry, and support tanks all took part. In total, more than 500 tanks were deployed. The British had also fielded the improved Mark V. Coordinated strikes by tanks, cavalry, infantry, and aircraft turned Amiens into a catastrophe for the German army. Thousands were killed or taken prisoner. Erich Ludendorff would later describe the opening day of Amiens in grim words: "August 8th was the blackest day in the history of the German army. Everything I had feared and warned of so often came to pass in a single place, in a single day." Reporting the battle to Kaiser Wilhelm, Ludendorff received a reply that summed up the situation: "We have reached the limits of our capacity. The war must be ended." The new Allied offensives, striking at exhausted Germany, had a crucial difference from the early years of the war. No longer did they concentrate on one point in hopes of a great breakthrough. Instead, corps from Belgium, France, Canada, Australia, Britain, and other Allied nations attacked across the German lines like swarms of stinging flies, keeping the pressure constant while avoiding catastrophic losses. They could see Germany's energy draining away, and they were simply waiting for the door to finally break. The days when a kilometre of ground required weeks of fighting were over. Germany's problems were not confined to the battlefield. The population, demoralised and exhausted, now demanded peace. Many statesmen, including Hindenburg and Ludendorff, feared that if the war did not end soon and reforms were not enacted, the people might rise in revolution just as they had in Russia. After all, when US President Woodrow Wilson had brought America into the war, he had spoken of a relatively mild peace. How bad could the terms really be? Ludendorff, in naive optimism, even believed that Alsace-Lorraine might somehow be retained. On the 3rd of October 1918, both Germany and Austria-Hungary sent a peace note to Wilson. But British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau had no intention of agreeing to a soft peace. Moreover, Wilson hinted that an armistice would require Germany to abandon the monarchy altogether. In practice, the conditions being discussed amounted to unconditional surrender, something Germany could not accept. Yet Germany had no options left. Around the same time, at the Battle of St. Quentin, the Hindenburg Line was pierced in several places. Dozens of kilometers of breaches had opened, and the war was about to reach the German homeland itself. Chaos reigned across the country. Though unwilling to accept unconditional surrender, the German army was forced into retreat throughout October as its great defensive system collapsed. Then came the worst-case scenario. In the Navy, sailors mutinied, refusing to obey orders in their desire to end the slaughter. At the same time, the atmosphere of revolution hung heavy over German cities. Workers struck, crowds filled the streets, and the winds of socialism threatened to bring about a German version of the Russian Revolution. In a desperate attempt to calm the situation and prevent outright revolution, Chancellor Max von Baden announced on the 9th of November 1918 that Kaiser Wilhelm had abdicated. Germany now stood at the brink of both revolution and armistice. In just a few days, the unthinkable had happened. The nation faced the threat of invasion. Its army mutinied. Its people rose in revolt. A socialist revolution loomed. The Kaiser was forced from his throne, and the once mighty German Empire was swept aside in a sudden regime change, giving way to the Weimar Republic. In this atmosphere, in the forest of Compiègne near the French town of Ruthons, the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, bringing humanity's first great catastrophe to an end. On the 11th of November 1918, people all over the world celebrated, dancing in the streets, drinking champagne, and hailing the armistice that meant the end of the war. But at the front, there were no celebrations. Many soldiers believed the armistice was only a temporary measure, that the war would soon begin again. When night fell, an otherworldly silence gnawed at their spirits. For the first time, men sat around log fires on the front line. They tried to reassure themselves that no enemy batteries watched them from the next ridge, that no German bombers would come to destroy them. They spoke in low voices. They were uneasy. The long-awaited peace brought anything but calm. Like the soldiers, the peoples of Europe were restless and angry. Whether victors or vanquished, many nations were shaken by uprisings. People, crushed under terrible conditions, could no longer be suppressed, and in city after city the flames of revolt flared. The war had ended, but the mission of the tanks had not. The very machines that had stumbled through their apprenticeship on the battlefield now turned their guns upon the crowds. The war to end war, or the war to end all wars, phrases often used to describe the First World War, proved to be tragically optimistic. The aftermath of the conflict became the seabed of dozens of new wars. The victors demanded that the defeated pay the price. The suffering and destruction had to be accounted for, and the burden placed upon the losers. The harsh conditions imposed would reshape the world in unforeseen ways. Some nations resisted these terms directly. Others nursed their thirst for vengeance, and in doing so, prepared to drag the world into a new inferno. The First World War laid the foundations for many innovations, most of them to humanity's detriment. Tanks were one of these, but they would not remain a novelty. They would continue to evolve year after year. The story of the tank was only just beginning.